Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul Kalemkiarian, the show where we peel back one bottle, one cork, and one label at a time. The wine business, and always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, sporting the new Pure Wine series where we deliver organic and biodynamic wines to your doorstep. But most importantly is the idea of our guest list, and I am so proud and honored to have one of the greats in this industry, one of the humble guys, one of the guys that do this because they love it, and that's Peter Koff. He is a master of wine. He's with us today from the Ferris Cape Wine Distribution Company, as well as other things. But Peter, we've gone through this conversation, I don't know how many times over the years. How many years do you think it's been? 10, 15, 20 years?
Ever since I first started to call on you. I mean, I've been a master of wine since 1993.
So master of wine, the master of wine. There's been a lot of awareness of the SOM programs, the movies, and I get the question all the time. I'm sure you do too. But what is the master of wine? And then we'll kind of go through what the consumer what you feel the consumer, the listeners may understand what it would be. But the master of wine, okay, let me say my definition, and then you tell me if it's accurate. And that is, it's really the academic side of understanding wine. That's the simplest definition I can come up with.
I think the Master Soms would then complain that they do that too. So it serves to go back to the history of the Master of Wine, back into the early 50s. At that point in time, basically the commercialization of all the major wine regions in the world, anything from Bordeaux, Burgundy, Port, was carried out in England by the English wine trade. And so they decided to put together a qualification for the wine trade, something formal, an idea that if we are going to bring the wines of the world, first of all to the people of England, but second of all to commercialize those wines around the world, we need to have, or they at that time need to have, some very specific knowledge. And so the trade put together their program of Master of Wine, managed by the Institute of Masters of Wine. Each Master of Wine is a member of the Institute, the Code of Ethics and all that sort of thing. But the idea was to understand the trade of wine.
The trade is one. So not just the academia of it, but the commerce of it as well.
It's not even specifically the academia. Yes, to understand the trade of wine and to be working with the wines from all over the world. In those days, a lot of the producers, even in very fine and famous appellations, didn't really know all that much. Things like Brettanomyces and that.
Yeah.
So the British wine trade not only found that they knew what they were talking about when they were importing the wines and trying to commercialize them, but they could then say to these people stylistically, you're not making the best of your terroir. So there's a whole academic side there. How does one make wine? How does one stop it from spoiling? And all of those things that went along with it. So today, the Master of Wine exam, besides the 3 blind tasting tests, one for white wine, one for red wine, and one that can be anything, sparkling wine, fortified wine, and anything else. You have got papers on the business of wine, viticulture, and enology, and general topics in wine.
So I will reveal this. And Peter's my sponsor to an application into the Institute of the Master of Wine. And you just struck a chord, because the entrance test is an entrance exam, besides the application, was I believe that the 3 questions that I could choose from on the business side were from one of the finals from a previous year. And one of the questions was, fortunately for me, was on the packaging of wine, which I get. I mean, I've been following it since the 80s. So that was an hour and a half question I had to ask on that subject, which I was able to choose. And then it was a blind tasting, not a blind tasting, it was a tasting of 4 different wines and the description thereof and those kinds of things. So when the Master of Wine was founded in 1950, first of all, the California trade was, pretty much not happening. There wasn't a whole lot. There was some wines here, but they were certainly no pedigree. But the rest of the world, the French have been, the classification of the Bordeaux was 1855, so they've been around for quite a long time, hundreds of years by then. And what did they pick up when this Master of Wine program started? What did they learn from themselves? Was there techniques that they didn't know occurred, or?
Not specifically, but you must remember in those days, when I say that the trade did the commercialization of wine, the Bordeaux guys in the 50s, they weren't bottling on the property. Those wines were being imported in barrel by the merchants in England and bottled in England.
Really?
So it was only much later, it might even have been the early 70s, or even maybe a little bit before then, that the top properties of Bordeaux actually realized that they needed to have full control and take full control of the winemaking and the wine elaboration, and also the marketing, that they started to bottle at the property. So when I say these guys, the masters of wine, made markets, they went to Bordeaux, they bought the wine, they brought it back to England, they barreled it, they blended it.
That's interesting, because on the label, I teach my staff this, and certainly consumers, that when it says, mise en bouteille au chateau, at the chateau, that didn't always mean something.
It probably meant something, but they couldn't say it.
Couldn't say it, right? They couldn't say it, right? It actually means something. So we have this Master of Wine, right? So this is a program. It's, I don't know, what do you think? It's about a 5-year program if you're to get through it from scratch or something like that?
There are 1 or 2 guys that have gotten through that program in 4 years. I believe that the minimum is 4 years.
Yeah.
I believe that the average is probably 7.
Really? Okay.
And you only have a certain number of times to try it. And if you cannot achieve a pass rate through the exam after a certain number of tries, you have to go back to scratch.
You don't get to try anymore.
No, because you see, the first few times, if you pass some parts of it, those count.
Yeah. Okay.
And so you got them in storage, basically.
It's kind of like the CPA exam my wife took. If you take the ethics side, you take the business side, and you bank that. You get to count on that, and you can just take the pieces later.
But after a certain number of years, if you haven't passed them all, you then have to apply again. And if they believe that the outcome would be different this time, then they will readmit you to the program, and you start again.
This is very encouraging.
People don't do that. People don't do that. I think they kind of figure that if they haven't got through it by then, they're not going to get through it. Maybe because they're too busy, or maybe because, for one reason or another, it's just too difficult.
It seems like, and this is not even where I wanted to go, but I think I want to go there now. This is, obviously it takes extraordinary amount of passion and, I'm going to say, pursuit of the knowledge to get that far. In other words, to have the discipline to continue to do this and to achieve this award that you're going to basically be awarded to, or this diploma, you must be absolutely committed to the concept that you're going to earn this degree. I don't think you could do it without, just for the business side of it, like, I want to get my Master of Wine because my business will be better, or I'll learn how to sell wine better. That's not the point. It's going to be, I really want to understand and peel this business back.
I think that's true, although today, less so. Today, I think there are many people that are entering the Master of Wine program because they perceive that the letters MW behind their name will guarantee them better opportunities in the industry.
Yeah.
For me, it wasn't like that.
Yeah.
For me, if I had lived in England, I might have said, okay, if you want to be the top wine buyer for one of the major beverage retailers or for one of the major supermarket chains, then you probably needed, even then, that's more than 21 years ago, and certainly now, you probably needed to be a Master of Wine. And for me, it was passion.
Yeah.
It was the passion to want to know as much as possible. When people ask me, well, what does it take? I say, well, you have to have a passion for those kind of things that normal people look at you and say, this guy needs to get a life. Yeah. Who cares what clones and what slopes?
Well, I should pass the test already.
So, for me, it was absolutely passion. And only passion would, again, in my case, only passion would have been enough to drive me, whilst trying to start a business, to continually read and taste. And mark my words, the blind tasting, when you want to taste the classics, you have to get the classics under your belt. Yeah. So you need to be drinking Class Growth Bordeaux and Burgundy and, Barolos and Barbarescos. Yeah. They don't come cheap. So, it's a lot of passion and a lot of commitment. And in the end, when people ask me, well, why did I do it? The real truth of the matter is for the satisfaction. Yeah. I had been avidly reading about wine since I first got into the idea. And the people whose readings I enjoyed the most, mainly I was subscribing to Decanter magazine, were all masters of wine.
Yep.
And I always said to myself, man, wouldn't I like to be counted amongst their number?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's it for me. And I don't know if it happens to everybody. Maybe it probably doesn't. I get so many people that come to sell us things. I'll give you an example. I won't name any names, but we had a wine dinner here, a wine tasting for my customers. They paid for it. It was a well-known Napa Valley winery, and they sent a representative down, young man who knew all the stuff about the wine. He knew about the founders, and he knew the history of the land, and there was no conviction or passion about the presentation. It was just, this is my job. So until I jumped in with Ed Maciana and moved the needle on this conversation about wine in general, and even the young man woke up and said, oh, gee, this is really interesting, because we were talking about things that were not part of the list that was on his agenda, right? We were talking about the wine part, the passion of the wine. And for me, that's new. It's relatively new, and this is why I came to you and asked you about the program, because maybe the last 2 years, and maybe it's because I've interviewed folks like you and winemakers from Chateau Talbot and guys from Smith Lafitte and Jacques Lardier. These guys, I've had these conversations, and it kind of rubs off. Mm-hmm. You start to understand what's going on. So your path was passion, knowledge, and I want to be part of that group, which is a great motivation.
It starts before then. I got the passion in South Africa, where I lived at the time. And of course, I was reading the Masters of Wine. But at that point in time, if you wanted to be a Master of Wine, you needed to be in the English wine trade. There was no other way. It was not an international qualification. But we started something in South Africa with the involvement of the Institute of Masters of Wine. We started something in South Africa. One of the big wholesalers, actually producer wholesalers, started something called Cape Wine Master, which was vetted by, supported by, and in the first few years marked by the Masters of Wine. And so the idea was that the paper would be almost identical to the Masters of Wine, except that you knew that it was South African centric, and that at least 50% of the wines in the blind tastings would be South African wines. But there was an added element to it. Since the South African industry was so dependent on brandy, you also had to know brandy and distillates, which you didn't and still don't for the Masters of Wine. So they invited me to do the program because they had seen that I was constantly contacting them. Where can I read more? Where's more? Where's more? So eventually they called me up and they said, this is just made for you.
Wow.
That we're going to do this, and it's associated with the Institute of Masters of Wine. You are not going to be a Master of Wine. Let's make that quite clear.
Yeah.
But you will be a Cape Wine Master, and as a minimum, it's a standard that the Masters of Wine appreciate, because they are in some small way involved with those papers.
Wow.
And so that's where I started. It was only when I came here and then the Institute went global that I realized I can live in the US and become a Master of Wine.
Wow.
And that's when I did
That's
it.
great.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to dovetail on. I forgot. It was when the Master of Wine started in the 50s, and there was this the idea that wine was coming from Bordeaux or wherever it was coming from and being bottled and elevated in England. The Armenian cognac trade, which I've had this conversation with some Armenian winemakers recently, and I didn't know all of this, even though I'm Armenian. But when the Soviet bloc was running Armenia and Turkey and Georgia and all that, they said, oh, Armenia, you're responsible for brandy. We don't care about your still wines or your white wines, your red wines. You're going to make brandy for the Soviets, and the Georgians are going to make wine and that thing. And then Winston Churchill's favorite brandy was Armenian, but it was brought in bulk to England and elevated there as before he got it. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fascinating story for me, because now the Armenian trade is growing very big and it's very good. But I had not heard that it was stipulated by the Russian government that this is what you're going to do for us when it comes to drinking. So,
well, you know, you were involved in a trip that I did to Georgia.
Yeah, to Georgia, yeah.
And at the time, what had happened was Georgia was having some kind of a tiff with the Russians, and the Russians said, well, we'll stop buying the wine. In the end, it turned out to be really good for the Georgians, because what the Russians wanted, at least according to them, was A, cheap, and B, the white wines all had to be old. So they were selling them dirt cheap, tired old white wines. When they were forced into it, they started to make the current range of wines that they're making right now, which is outstanding.
You know, it's funny you said that, because I had the two Armenian guys that came in here, and they have Paul Hobbs on their side. He's the consulting winemaker, and he wants his name on the label, which shocked me that he would actually want that. But they were talking about the harvest, and all the local farmers were freaking out because they started harvesting their grapes at a different time than the tradition was. And the tradition was making wine. They're hanging out there longer. They're getting oxidized just almost by the vines, right? And the wines, the sweet wine, the grapes were not good for making white wine, because they were harvesting based on the weight. They didn't want you have to carry heavier. They were harvesting too young. Okay, that's what the thing. Anyway, I want to get to that later. So
talking about harvest, by the way.
Yeah.
I have the opportunity this year with a French guy that I work with, whose wines I import a little bit of, a Burgundian.
Yes.
To go and make wine with him this year,
yeah,
to make
talked
wine
about
under
that.
my own label.
That was recently.
That's now. It's coming now. So you talk about harvest dates. I just learned today that Verizon has started, so I need to start thinking about when to book my ticket.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, so we have the Master of Wine. We'll go back to the subject. We have the Master of Wine. This is a very, very lofty and a goal that is not easy to obtain, and people now enter this sommelier program.
Right.
And I think up until not that long ago, really the idea of a sommelier was really somebody at a restaurant that understood the list and was able to curate for the consumer a bottle of wine at the dinner table. That's really what it meant, right?
That's correct.
There wasn't a degree, there wasn't a certification. And I don't know, I think they started in the 60s, the late 60s is when the Master Somm started. But it's a little more practical, it seems like, than the Master of Wine. It deals with, you said it deals with spirits, it deals with service. So explain the difference that you know.
I don't want to talk for the Court of Master Sommeliers. They would probably be able to describe it better than me. But
yes.
My understanding of it, and for sure there are a couple of Master Somms who are also Masters of Wine.
Yes.
Is that originally the idea was service. You were a guy who worked in a restaurant, and probably you had, if not major input, if you didn't control the list, you had major input into the list. So it was about buying wine and the service of wine. The service of wine includes everything: food and wine pairing, cooking with wine, service of wine. Where do you stand?
Yes, where you stand, decanting.
And decanting, and moving from right to left or left to right, and examining the cork. So all of those kind of things, the elegant service of wine, and I think you said it very, very well, which is curating the wine list and the experience for the diners, based on what you've got in your list, based on what they're eating, and also to be smart enough to base it on what they feel like spending.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're not going to give a guy an absolutely great experience when he wanted to spend $70 and you're trying to make him spend $350. So with time, of course, they evolved exams to make these guys master sommeliers, and they also do blind tasting exams. But unlike the blind tasting exams for the Masters of Wine, their blind tasting exams are on the fly. They are conducted live. They are not writing things down. They are given a glass of wine.
Yeah, right. That's interesting.
And they're tasting it, and they have to identify the faults and those other questions that go with it. Of course, they handle everything from the beginning of the dinner, so from aperitif through to the end of the dinner. So it would be brandy and cognac and Armagnac and port and cigars. And
that's an interesting thought, and you'll tell us whether the Master of Wine addresses all this. But when we were in Lyon and we went to the Paul Bocuse restaurant, and it happens here even at Wine of the Month Club when I have customers that walk in the door, and it's an intimidating question, but it's a necessary question for the consumer or the diner to feel comfortable about what they're doing. And it's the worst thing probably for you and I to get a wine list while you're sitting at a table of a bunch of people, because you don't know what they're willing to spend or willing to have on their tab when they're done, right? I go out with different groups of people. I know some of these guys enjoy wine. They'll spend $200 to $300 a bottle. They don't care. And I have other friends that don't want to spend more than $50. So to ask that question as a sommelier, like, what's your budget on this, is a very important piece of information that will satisfy the requirement of a pleasant experience. Because the Paul Bocuse guy, the sommelier, I said, I'd like a Bordeaux, and my budget, I just told him outright, my budget is €300 or €400. And he brought the list and said, in this price range. This is what I recommend you drink.
Right.
And it was great. As well as, though, I think it's very important, I think you'll agree, for instance, I went home the other night and I did not feel like a Bordeaux varietal. I didn't feel like Cabernet, I didn't feel like Merlot, I didn't feel like I wanted something different. My wife prefers those wines. So as a good husband, I poured her the Lafite brand from Argentina, the Caro brand, big, bold Cabernet, and I forewent my desires and and drank the same, okay? But the point being, the mood has a lot to do with it. What you think someone's going to feel like. What's a difficult challenge for a somm or a master of wine to say, look at you, what are you having for dinner, and what's your budget, and how do you feel? Because I think it's an experience, right? It's like, oh, I didn't feel like Bordeaux. I felt like Burgundy today, and I got a Bordeaux. That's not a good thing. I think that's an important feature of the practical side of the wine business. So the Somm program, there's level 1, 2, 3, I think, and 4th is the master, right? Something like that.
Not sure.
It's gotten such awareness lately with the movie, but at the same time, because of that, and not, this isn't to diss anything, it's just to point out, I mean, so many of the representatives that call me now, it's almost a requirement that they have some kind of Somm level, that they've passed something.
I used to, for my guys,
Yes.
I used to sponsor them to start the courses of the Court of the Master Sommeliers, and I used to pay them to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So
Or pay for them to do it, not pay them to do it.
And it's not that I have a problem with it, because I think it's important, because I can't tell you how many times people walk in here to sell me stuff, and they have zero experience to know what they're talking. One guy brought me plastic cups once, literally. He goes, "Oh, I brought the glasses. Don't worry, the tasting." He pulled out 4 plastic cups. I go, "No, we're not tasting it."
Well, that's interesting, because it's a hit against himself.
Yes.
The guys that I know that are really savvy, they come in there with the Riedel sommelier steps to pour for you.
Because it
makes two-buck chuck taste great, or at least the idea of having it in that glass for sure adds on a few points.
It's part of the experience.
Oh.
Unless you put it in a Johnny Rockets, Coca-Cola cup. Right?
No, I mean, I posted yesterday something that's absolutely standard in the industry, which is you as a buyer, you buy on apples, because apples make the wine taste more acidic. I, as the seller, would rather have you taste those wines with cheese, because cheese makes the wine rounder and smoother.
Yeah.
So coming in here trying to sell you something with little plastic cups is really dumb. I'm used to that from when I go and try and sell wine to a retailer, and he hauls out these little plastic thimbles, and I say, "Oh my God, Chateau Lafite doesn't taste any good in those. Never mind what I'm pouring."
You can't. People don't understand that. But there's a diner up the street called Leroy's. I used to go there 3 days a week. Monte Cristo sandwiches and club sandwiches. And I did taste. Who was the master of wine that was making wine in Washington? David Lake.
Oh yeah,
passed away a few years ago.
He did.
But I was tasting his Columbia wines in an amber tumbler at an American diner owned by a Greek guy. So that's how smart I am. So the Master Somm Pro, I think it's a degree. I think it's very important, and I think we touched on the practicality of it in the marketplace. There was a time, and particularly in Vegas, where if you had a Master Somm or at least a level 3, you were a 6-digit wage earner. Because you curated a list at the casino,
right?
And those jobs are gone.
Right. In the early 90s, when Las Vegas was in the process of upgrading itself, they realized that they had the entertainment, but they needed to upgrade the accommodations and the things that go along with accommodations for well-heeled people, meaning food and wine. They literally sucked up all the Master Somm talent in the country, imported them to Las Vegas, and let them build wine lists, and didn't put dollar values on what they could spend. And as you say, we're paying them 6 figures. And that's all been done now, and there's a lot of people that understand it, and a lot of those Master Somms have now left.
Yeah.
But they were really majorly important for the ability of Las Vegas to catch up with the wining and dining experiences that those people who would go gambling in St. Moritz or wherever it might be, Monte Carlo, would expect.
It did change the landscape of the job market, but it's changed that since the recession. Vegas is a totally different animal.
Yeah.
And we'll get into the wholesale side now, which is interesting to me, because there's a restaurant in Manhattan Beach called the Arthur J. And really fine wine list, beautiful. And I told the Somm not too long ago, I said, you must have 100 vendors to supply this list. I recognize a lot of the wines and who sells them. He goes, yeah, I said 75. He says, it's 100. Now that's a difficult task for any entrepreneur or business to have to write 100 different checks just for the wine list or something like that over the course of time, right? And so there's been a change, it seems like, and maybe you can reflect on this with your side, because Peter sells a lot of South African and now French and I think Italian too in your wholesale
More Italian
book.
Than anything else.
Yeah, now more Italian. Mm-hmm. So in your wholesale book, and so you see the changes I see or am seeing, and maybe the conversations you've had with retailers or restaurateurs are going to reflect what we're going to talk about. But I see a lot of consolidation. I see a lot of brand consolidation. A good friend of mine, Alex Gararci from Gararci Wine Imports and Napa Wines, his major account was pulled from him. The Monty's brand, that's a huge thing to happen to import. Yeah. So, are you seeing less wholesalers in the marketplace, and how are they affecting what you do every day?
So I think there are fewer wholesalers in the marketplace. With the downturn in 2008, some of them fell by the wayside, and the bigger guys capitalized on that.
You have Southern and Glazer together.
Right.
So you have Young's and whatever they're joining with. Their books are getting this thick.
Yeah. So I think there's no doubt that that's happened. Now what I am seeing now is a crop of new, switched-on guys that are looking for niches, be it natural wine or organic biodynamic wine or a small area that they do properly. These are, generally speaking, younger guys with an amazing amount of passion, remind me of myself a few years back. And if they can get...
You still have the passion, Peter.
I know, I do have the passion. If they can get the restaurateurs, some of whom are like them, so that's fine, and the wine shop guys, the buyers, to sit down with them and taste the wine, then they can make quite decent business, because they are bringing some really interesting things to the market, not necessarily at very, very high prices. So the question is, are our retailers then prepared to do the work? A, giving these guys the time, and B, adding to the number of SKUs, and yes, adding to the number of checks that they have to sign, and C, working on the floor or training the people on the floor to sell these things. Okay.
It's the education of the
but it's also
customer.
it's very, I listened to you talking about the guy who's got this amazing wine list and he's got 100 suppliers. Now, if I were a restaurateur hiring a guy to come and select my wine list for me, and he would tell me, look, I don't really feel like working so hard. I only really want to deal with 10 suppliers. More than that, it's too much. I said, I'm sorry, my friend, you don't have the passion that's required to do this job.
That's a good point.
If you want to have a grand award, Spectator Grand Award wine list, and I think those things have kind of fallen by the wayside too, but if you wanted something like that, if you really wanted something for everybody at every level, you need to be prepared to taste. And to taste a lot, and if that means you have to add an extra check to write once a month or once every 6 weeks, so what? You've probably got a department that does it for you.
Probably.
So it's not for me really almost negotiable, but I understand I'm an outlier there. That's not the way the business works anymore.
Well, it's maybe in California because the taxes and the minimum wages went up. My cousin owns a very famous restaurant in Pasadena, and he was just telling me, this is 2 weeks ago, that he's got a very extensive list. In fact, I had Valentino Valentini from Boccale in here. Is a Montefalco based thing, Sagrantino, right? And it was on his, and gorgeous wines, and it was on my cousin's list. I didn't look at the vintage. I've never sent a bottle back, by the way, Peter, ever at a restaurant, a whole bottle. I've sent glasses back because it was open 3 weeks ago and they never bothered to cycle through. But I had to send a bottle back to my own cousin because.
So you've never sent a bottle back because you just didn't want to?
No,
or because you've never had a bad bottle?
I've never had a bad tainted bottle.
Oh, I've had a few.
Yeah,
more than a few.
So, but a lot of glasses.
Yeah.
When did you open this? 3 days ago. Well, no wonder.
So that's I always ask. If I'm going to buy wine in a restaurant by the glass, I ask when it was open.
Yes. I learned that lesson finally. But I got the Sagrantino, and it was totally gone. It was a 2008. I didn't see the vintage on the thing. So then he proceeds to tell me that one of the big suppliers has made an offer to him to replace everything on his list. Now, he's probably got, I don't know, 200 SKUs, maybe something like that, maybe more. It's a rather extensive list, lots of Italian wines and American wines. And the wholesalers come in, another one, one of the big guys, and said, I will buy out. All this stuff will be free for you to sell off. You'll make 100% margin on the wine, on every dollar you take in, and I'm going to replace it with my stuff. Now, from a restaurateur who every dollar matters, it's a pretty attractive offer. But what happens to his list? His list becomes, you and I can walk into a restaurant and look at the list and say, oh, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so.
Sure.
We know that already, right? The consumer doesn't know that. And so he's taking a look at the bottom line saying, well, the Sagrantino went bad on me because I was buying it from this little importer, and maybe I don't need Sagrantino. Right.
So that's a problem for me, because if that gets expanded, then guys like me who live, eat, sleep, and breathe, bringing interesting and unique things to the market and passionately advocating for them, then what that guy is saying, your cousin, is, and I've heard it many times, the consumer doesn't know. As long as we put something wet in the glass at the color that they want, at the price that they're prepared to pay, the consumer doesn't know. Then I think to myself, okay, if the consumer really doesn't know, what have I spent 40 years in this business for?
That's a good point.
Or 40 years loving wine for?
No, that's a good point.
And I deal on the other side with producers who will not take me to the cellar, who will take me to the vineyard and fall on their knees and scrabble through the soil and bring the soil out and say, just look what I got to work with.
Taste this, smell
and
this.
then there would be earthworms in it and say, see, it lives.
Yeah.
You're
right.
What do I do with guys like that when those are the guys I believe in?
Those are the guys you want to present. And that, to the restaurateur, and maybe even to the novice retailer, or the retailer that just is worried about the bottom line, to educate their client and the customer on the value of what you just said. Because I'm with you. I want to see that soil, and I want to smell it, I want to taste it. Probably the best wine tour I've ever been on was with Chateau de Jacques with Cyril Charouz, and we went into the cellar, and he had buckets of Côte de Pie, and he had all these different locations in the Beaujolais region, and you could smell it. And I took two friends, and they're actually like putting their hands, and I go, this is really cool. They really want to understand the difference of what the passion of the wine is. But I don't know, on the business side, and I certainly am not saying anything about your business, your wines have always been great, but I can't, as a restaurateur, that's the guy that has to make that decision. They have to decide whether I'm going to have that list. Now, I go to Arthur J's because the list is so great.
But he doesn't have the passion.
No, he does. No, it's
so if he doesn't have the passion, ultimately, again, I'm the sort of believer in this cosmos. If he doesn't have the passion, that will show up ultimately in the food. So then, how do you separate yourself from the others? You're all a bunch of restaurants. Let's assume that, what was the theme? Is it French, Italian?
It's Italian.
Is it? Italian. So if there's one thing that there's no shortage of in this state and in this country, it's Italian wines, Italian restaurants. So how do you pick out the very, very best wines? Where the food is fantastic and the list matches, how do you pick that out? One would hope that the wine writers, the restaurant writers that write about it, would also spend a little bit more time on the wine list, like they do in England. But they don't seem to do that much here. They comment on the list, but not that much. And so I'm not sure that that's legal. Buying out.
I don't know. That's why I didn't mention any names.
And I'm not sure that that's legal, but I do know that gets offered. We see it all the time.
Yeah, all the time. Well, most of them are going after the well. I mean, I don't know if the consumer knows that the value to a wine and alcohol list is the well, right? You want the house pour, vodka, gin, bourbon, and that's what they all muscle for. We all know this, right? I think that's a really an important part of this podcast is. And I'll have to tell you, I have one of my best friends. They're driving to Tahoe yesterday. This is yesterday. And in a couple of podcasts, I've sort of thrown them under the bus. No names, but I've mentioned a couple of my friends that have brand new wine cellars, and all they have in there is Napa cabs. Okay? Well, they listened. And I got a phone call immediately, halfway to Tahoe. 3.5 hours into a drive, they called me up, and she was upset with me that I said, I go, look, I didn't mention any names, and how do you know it was you? But the concept is, I have this new passion to expose people and the Monk Club's always done that. That's what we've tried to do. We buy these interesting things so people can know. But I also have the business side to say, well, I know what they like to buy. Right now the trend is sort of these, 2 to 3% sugar wines that have a little bit of fruit character, but they're easy to swallow. They're softer and they're just easy to drink. And when I present something really interesting like a Cabernet Franc from the Loire, it's a little more difficult to understand, right? But I have this great ambition to educate the palate, right, and show them good things. And I think that's what you've always wanted to do.
Right. And I think you are sitting with a great opportunity just to step back. There's another way of doing it. Valerie and I my wife, were recently in London. And we went to a couple of the new restaurants, that are very in, like Ottolenghi and people like that. And there they've got excellent somms because the wine lists are not big. We are not talking about Burns Steakhouse type 3,000 lists. And I'm not knocking that.
No,
knocking that at all. But they are lists with 40 wines on them. And every one of those 40 wines is available by the glass. Anything.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
anything
unusual.
From natural wine that sometimes isn't perfectly clear, and biodynamic wines and pinotage from South Africa and things that you might not necessarily normally see.
Yeah.
Poulsard from Savoie, Jura, and so on. Interesting things like that I could sit at a list like that during the day when nobody else wanted to have a glass of wine because I was on holiday, and go through the list and say, bring me a glass of that, bring me a glass of that, bring me a glass of that, and be quite happy
to
drink those wines. So there was an opportunity to have a fantastic list with only a few selections, but they're carefully curated by somebody who really knows what he or she is doing. They could probably manage 4 or 5 restaurants' wine lists like that. But in all probability, of those 40 wines, you're dealing with 15 suppliers.
Probably, but you're educating the consumer by letting them taste something that they would otherwise ever taste.
You're giving them an amazing experience.
Yeah.
For example, myself, when I go into a top restaurant that has a Master Somm in it or something like that, and then the guys come over to me and they say, well, here's the list. We know you're a master of wine. Here's the list. No.
Yeah.
You chose this list. You pick the wine.
That's right. That's really important.
Yeah.
We were in New York at forgot the brand of the restaurant, a very famous place, and the Somm brought me the list, and there was a wine that I actually selected in 1989 or 1990, Grand Puy de Casse, I think it was. But it was a wine we had featured in the club, but she had never tasted it because she didn't do the list. She was a newer Somm. So I wanted her to taste. I said, I want this. I remember the wine. I bought it many, many, many years ago. I'd like to see how it's doing today. And she goes, so would I. So we invited her to sit and have a glass with us because it's her list. She should know what it tastes like and where it belongs on her spectrum of wines, right? So I want to move to the consumer trends. Is a little bit what we just talked about, but we talked about you mentioned the term natural wine. I wrote something on LinkedIn. I actually sent that article to the Institute of the Masters of Wine because there is no such thing, the term generally. But biodynamic, organic, huge trends. Are they doing that in South Africa? Are there a lot of organic biodynamic?
There's a lot of organic.
Yeah.
There's a couple of biodynamic producers, one of whom I used to import. But he just got, he was living a biodynamic lifestyle, which eventually took him to Sedona, Arizona for the sort of spirituality of Sedona, Arizona. And so he no longer makes wine in South Africa. He was making amazing wines.
I've never heard of that fallout for the biodynamic wine movement.
That was it. We had talked about, him and I, this was about 20 years ago. We had talked about him and I buying some land. That was when Oregon was getting hot, the Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
And we had talked about buying some some vineyard land in that place, in the Willamette Valley, and for us to produce wine from the get-go, biodynamic. So he came here and he was traveling by car and went to Sedona and never left, basically. So we didn't do it.
The lifestyle, the biodynamic lifestyle took over the biodynamic wine movement. Well, there's clubs out there that do this. We've started a club that's focused on organic and biodynamic, and the consumer totally understands the difference. But the idea of natural wine. I did a little research. I mean, the FDA doesn't even have a natural food definition. It's an assumption that natural food, if you put natural on your bag of bagels, that it's assumed by the FDA that there's nothing in there that wouldn't be in there naturally. But there's nobody's telling you that's the way it has to be. For flavorings, yes, there's a definition for natural flavorings, definition for artificial flavorings, but not for natural food, as there is none for natural wine. It's assumed then that it's wine with less intervention, right? But organic would be natural, biodynamic would be natual. I mean,
no, neither of those are natural. They're allowed to use certain elemental things,
like copper.
Organic. They are allowed to use these things in elemental form. I think for me, natural, which is almost spurning the use of anything, is just, I wrote a long article on it recently. Just to start, wine is not natural. How can you say that, Peter? It's made from grape. Because everywhere you plant those grapes, 99.9% of the time where you plant those grapes, they were not there before.
That's true.
You had to excavate a hill or a piece of land, dig up the scrub, do soil ameliorations, and plant your chosen variety based on a lot of, observations of soil and climate, of course, personal preference.
Agreed.
So by the time you're even picking the grapes, never mind trellising and harvesting and canopy management and all of those things. By the time you do that, you're not getting natural grapes.
Yeah.
Okay. So why would you then take those grapes, press them, and just leave them to be what they will be? So when I find natural wines that are off, Brettanomyces, geranium, off smells of various sorts, looks like something that was excreted rather than something that should be drunk, I sort of draw the line at that. But am I in favor of natural wines to the extent that you can get away with it? I'm looking at people that are trying to experiment with no sulfur use, those kind of things, where it's done with knowledge, preferably with education, university education, knowledge and passion and an understanding, at least at this point in time, of what's possible. Yes, I really look forward to those wines.
I agree. That conversation I had recently with the idea that as soon as you start a farm, it's no longer natural, right?
Exactly.
I had Ambeth in here, Garrett. His name was Garrett, and they're in Paso. I think probably one of the few biodynamic vineyards in Paso Robles, and the wines look extraordinarily rustic just when you pour them in the glass. I mean, the orange wine is orange and opaque. It's not. There's nothing natural looking about it as far as compared to, let's say, natural meaning our traditional baseline of looking at a bottle of wine as clear and clean. That would be natural to most people, right? But he said, this is very interesting to me. He said that we are right next to a conventionally farmed winery, and they're in the near Tascadero, the Creston area. He says, now that we are biodynamic and there's weeds and animals and spider webs and spiders and insects and everything, it's alive. Like you said, the soil's alive with what's going on below the crust. And next door, literally across the road, is a pristine. He says, it doesn't look right. When you put them next to each other, he said, that does not look right. It doesn't look healthy because it's so clean and so manipulated. I thought that was a very interesting comment, because you would see a bush vine grape and it's just, how can you make any wine from that? It does affect the quality of the grape, does it not? If you're not canopying and if you're not trellising and if you're not exposing it to the sun, that's going to be a different grape than the guy that does.
But the viticulture is not an element of biodynamic wine. Maybe for the natural wine producers, they want to go that far and say, we're just not going to do anything in the vineyard at all. But then again, that takes us back to the original point, which was to have grapes there in the first place, they had to do stuff.
Right.
So, no, you don't have to really turn your back on it and say, okay, we're natural winemakers now, we don't do anything. No, that's irresponsible, both for yourself and for the consumer.
So the biodynamic movement, which includes the gravitational pull of the moon, and when you plant, and I think they even arrange the bottles in the cellar to, the magnetic north. I mean, there's all kinds of things that go along with it. But I do, and it maybe sounds like hocus pocus to a lot of people, but Piero Incenza of Bodega Chakra, this grandson of Sasakaya, said and I thought this was fascinating, and I thought is that, well, look, your body is 90% water, the Earth is 7/10 water, and the moon can move the vast oceans. It can change the tide. How much effect does it have on a vineyard and the water and the soil and in your body? It seems to me it would be a rather large amount, and that there's value to those things. I've never been able to taste a biodynamic wine from the same vineyard where across the road is conventionally farmed, and then across the way is biodynamic, and taste the difference. Same winemaker, same barrels, whatever. But I think they're different. I think they would be different.
I think they are different. I'm not actually put myself to the test of tasting wines from across the road made by the same winemaker. I've actually, in a Burgundy cellar with the owner of the cellar, put myself through a test where they poured some of their biodynamic wine against some of their conventionally made wines, and both of us, myself and the owner, thought that the conventionally made wine was the biodynamic wine, but it was relatively early in the cycle.
Yeah.
What I have noticed with biodynamic wine, for me, is, I don't know if you remember, probably haven't done it for about 10 years now, but they used to have a traveling road show of wineries from around the world called a Return to Terroir or Back to Terroir or something like that.
Yeah, I remember
and they used to come here, and it was all biodynamic wine.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I remember
it was
the
all
term.
biodynamic wine. They did a couple of shows. I went to one in Presidio Park, and I've been to a couple at Guggenheim. Was it Guggenheim? No, not at the Guggenheim. At the that museum that's just down the hill from that. And tasted those wines. And all I can say is that there's definitely something special going on there. The overall quality is really, really high. Now, people who go to the trouble of making wine biodynamically probably have the passion that if even working conventionally, they would make better wine.
Yeah.
What I have tend to notice
to
notice about biodynamic wine is, if you take the wines of Coulée de Saran, for example, Nicolas Joly, is that after a while, those wines are all made from Chenin Blanc, but they start to lose that overt Chenin Blanc character. So if you talk to the guys who make the biodynamic wines, they say, yes, because we have healthy vineyards. And it's now the vineyards that are talking, which is why we call this a return to terroir, where finally we're getting back to the point that vin de terroir means something versus vin de cépage.
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
that the voice of the Chenin Blanc is a little bit lower now because he's so happy where he's living.
Yeah. That's a valid
and so you
analogy.
These spectacular wines that are not as obviously varietal as they were.
Yeah. In fact, Ambeth was saying that during the heat waves, his biodynamic vines stand up taller and straighter during those sessions than across the way, because they've been fighting for a long time for their nutrients and their water, and dig deep to get it.
Right.
And he says they get a little tired in the afternoon, but across the street they're wilted almost, and then it starts over again the next day. And I think that was really a fascinating part of that conversation that I had with him. But do you think the consumer? Now, I've told the story 1,000 times on the podcast. For the listener, the auditeurs, I will try and net it out. But I have tasted really bad biodynamic wines and organic wines, and I've paid a lot of money for them. In New York in particular, when I went to a shop. And then there's websites where my competitors are touting the idea that they're healthier for you and you're not going to get a hangover and blah, blah, blah. So, and I don't know if you know the answer to this or if you have a speculation on it, but it seems like some of these consumers are going to buy them because they really think they're doing themselves a favor from the genetic standpoint and the DNA and the health, the santé, or it's a political thing because those are sustainable vineyards as well, so the carbon footprint's lower, and there's less water usage, it's recycled, and all the things that go along with sustainable farming, the minimum wage is paid, all the rest of it. So there's probably two reasons, I'm speculating, why people indulge themselves in biodynamic, looking for them.
So the three that you mentioned, actually, it's better for the planet, it's better for the human being, and it's just better wine.
Yes.
So what you're talking about, those wines, the expensive wines that you bought in New York that were biodynamic or organic and were not good. Fortunately, we live in a world now where those wines shouldn't exist.
Yes.
because there are organic and biodynamic wines that are really
They're
excellent.
great, for sure.
Yeah.
Taste a lot of them.
Yeah.
But the consumer, I'm trying to figure out now we're in the business.
Right.
We sell wines direct to the consumer, as you do now too. What are these people looking for? Are they looking for the political statement to buy something that's sustainable because of the better for the planet, or are they looking for this health benefit that I mean, come on, seriously, you're not going to get a hangover because you're drinking biodynamic wines. It's still 12 or 14% alcohol.
Well, but histamines and things like that. I think, you see it yourself. You deal directly with the consumer. You have the opportunity to change the consumer's mind or to introduce ideas and thoughts to the consumer. In my traditional role as an importer wholesaler, I deal with you, or I deal with retailers and restaurateurs. So if I try to sell them an organic wine, the first thing I do is I get pushback. Peter, if it's the same price as a wine and the same quality as a wine that's not organic, then I'll buy it. But I'm not prepared to pay a premium for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good point.
So to the extent then that we can get, again, what we are looking for, guys like me, we are looking for those old-fashioned, passionate retailers who get up in the morning dreaming about what fantastic bottle of wine to put in the customer's hands.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take those guys something that is better, yes, they might not be prepared to pay a premium for it, not right now, but down the road sometime, maybe.
If the customer's looking for it.
And if the customer's looking for it, but when a customer walks into a store and he's not already sure what he's looking for, he goes and he asks somebody at the store, what should I buy? Well,
yes.
You're not going to sell him something you don't have.
Right.
So, it makes it makes it quite easy.
Well, that's an interesting point, indirectly. Bodega Chakra, Mr. Incisa, he doesn't have anything on his label that suggests it's biodynamic, organic, or anything otherwise. It's just a regular label. You've got the French certification that you can put on there. People know what it means. You barely read it anyway, so probably no impact. But I'm guessing that some people are not even bothering labeling, for instance, vegan wine. John Sally, the basketball star, was selling a vegan wine from Clos de Champs. Big letters, vegan. Okay. Well, I'm a regular consumer, and I walk in the store and I see an end cap full of, and it says vegan wine. I'm probably not going to buy it because I don't know what that means, right? Which many wines you've probably already had were vegan anyway. It's just not announced.
Yeah.
So the part of this conversation is the packaging of wine and the consumer that sees this. And so John Sally, I've said this before, but he says, I'm having a difficult time selling this in the steakhouses. Well, because it says, big letters, vegan on it.
He must have been kidding, right?
Oh yeah, well, no, he says that I put my thumb over it and I pour it for them.
But why would he try and sell it in a steakhouse? The people are coming there not looking for vegan wine.
They're not looking
guessing.
for it. It's just good wine, though. The wine was good.
Oh,
Big
okay.
deal. So it was, wasn't filtered with egg whites. Fine with egg whites.
Egg whites or Benton. Not Bentonite, but
Isenglass,
the fish, or bull's blood, which is hardly ever used today.
So the packaging thereof. So here we are talking the academic side of what wine should be, biodynamic, organic. But when it comes down to it, when the consumer walks in or is being guided toward this, and they see all these emblems and all this stuff, they're not even sure what it means and whether or not they should venture into this idea because it's got too many emblems on it. And I think that's kind of why Bodega Chakra didn't put anything. And it's absolutely full-on biodynamic Pinot Noir from Patagonia. So and that's just a different challenge. The academic side of wine is an important part, and I think that's very fascinating. But you and I want to sell some things, so we are up against those headwinds to make sure that we're not offending a customer or uneducated customer or whatever we're trying to do. What's the worst description you've had somebody tell you about a wine? Like when you used to come to my Lime Street facility and Doré was there, we used to mess with the vendors and say, well, this has an iguana pea character, and they didn't know if we were serious or not. So they kind of went along with it. Yeah. But have you ever heard you say something that's just totally like, what are you saying?
Well, there's some of the classics. Sauvignon Blanc smelling like cat's pee.
Yeah, cat pee, right?
Cat pee.
But let's say in a consumer tasting, somebody says, this tastes like some of the contemporary things, Fruit Loops, Captain Crunch. They're coming up with these terms that aren't traditional.
Right. Well, one of them that is quite traditional for me, but that some people perceive to be, even on the label, to be something positive, is jammy. Now, to me, jammy is really a negative thing about wine. And yet there are wines out there that have jam on the label.
Yeah, right.
So, as if
agree.
it was something positive.
Yeah, they think it is.
Oh, and this one, you see a write-up of a Sauvignon Blanc that's in the US market where it says that it has a strong flavor of green peppers. It's like, that's exactly what California winemakers, with one or two exceptions, have been trying to do,
Right.
which is to carefully select those parcels or those clones that do not give you any of the capsicum flavors.
Right.
So,
I agree with that.
I, for the most part, don't get people coming and telling me what a wine tastes like, because I'm one of those guys. If somebody, first of all, I go to a place and I want to taste the wine. If somebody's just talking, is trying to sell me the wine and just talking, I sort of tune them out. And if they get too intrusive, I say, I tell you what, if I have any questions, I'll ask you. In the meanwhile, let me just concentrate on what I find here.
Yeah. Are they intimidated by you when you at a restaurant, if they know your degree? People intimidated generally? At a party, they say, well, Peter's coming. I get that quite a bit. And
I don't think they're intimidated.
Okay, good.
In fact, what I do find quite annoying is that a lot of the guys who would come and see me haven't taken the time, even 2 or 3 minutes, to figure out who I am.
Yeah.
Not that I'm a big deal.
No, right.
But who I am in terms of I've been around this business for a while and with a passion not equaled by many people.
Right.
So, don't try and come and tell me this, that, and the other.
Yes.
I'll let you know if I need something. So if the guys walk in and they already know of my qualifications and my experience, they tend to be a lot more humble. And then I don't have a problem with them. It's those guys that burst in on me like I'm just another guy buying wine for his 7-Eleven store, and I don't mean to knock those stores. But at that kind of price point and telling me what I should be looking for, no.
Yeah, I agree with that. And all the years, the people that call me the neophyte, I have a new lecture for the neophytes that come here.
Yeah.
This is the way I do it. You'll be taken care of. You'll be treated fairly, and you'll be given an objective analysis. And when you leave, you know where you stand. But please don't tell me about the one-arm picker, one-arm paper hanger that picked the grapes. That doesn't matter to me because it'll tell itself in the glass.
We're trying to sell wine. In the end, it's what's in the bottle and what the package looks like and how much we have to pay for it.
So the other day, I opened a bottle of. This is going back to the description that I thought was very unusual, but it hit me, and it was my own description, oddly. But I opened a bottle of Muscat. It was from the Ruther Glen. It was a sweet wine. It was a dessert wine. I think it's fortified, right?
Yeah.
And my wife just got a brand new BMW. Okay, I swear this wine smelled like the inside of her car. So I had to take her out of her office downstairs and say, Sandra, you gotta smell this, because doesn't it smell like your new car? And she's like, oh my gosh, it really does. And I don't know where that came from, but it was this faint smell. So I thought, okay, new car smells. That's an interesting description of a wine. I mean, you heard a Band-Aid box and things, right? But
it's a good one, as long as it's not overly leathery, which is code for Brettanomyces.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, so good.
So one of the ones for me that's very positive, a descriptive for me, is of the kind of Sauvignon Blancs that I'm looking for. You get them partially in the Loire. For sure, you get them in South Africa and sometimes in Chile. Are those Sauvignon Blancs, when you taste them, they taste like streets after the rain. So when you spray a warm driveway, that sort of wet gravel smell that comes off a warm driveway. And in South Africa, where I lived in Johannesburg, you had summer rainfall. So at 6 o'clock in the evening, you would get this downpour on the tarmac after a whole day's sun, and it was this gravelly, wet gravel smell.
That's so interesting. I know exactly what you're saying, and I smell it next. So what's next for Peter when it comes to Ferris Cape, your new venture with the direct-to-consumer thing? Is that it, or we have other things to learn, like Armenian wines? And
well, that direct-to-consumer thing, I think, is for all of us, is very important. We have just almost touched on, you and I right now, what I consider to be the dumbing down of the industry here.
Oh, God.
The consolidation, too many people, too much volume of the things that they have to sell, not enough truly educated passionate people, and I'm not surprised because in our industry, if you have the kind of passion and education that it takes to be a really good wine person, probably if you took that passion and education, applied it to another sphere of endeavor, you'd make more money and you'd make it in a shorter period of time. But the direct-to-consumer business does give us an opportunity to directly, providing we have enough volume of people to buy our wines, gives you an opportunity to go directly to these tiny little places, not necessarily tiny, but where these awesome wines are being made, where it is almost impossible to develop a market. And to be able to offer these guys the opportunity of selling 50, 70, 80 cases a year in the United States, and easier for you to sell them because you are going directly to the winery, you are selling them to your consumer, you're writing them up, they trust you. They trust you. That's the pipe dream for me.
Yeah.
But the key is you've got to build up that side of the business where you have sold yourself, Paul as wine of the month guy, or me as Peter Koff MW, an importer, where you have sold yourself as the brand. And people will follow you because they believe this guy knows and we get a fair deal.
So that's ideologically right on. That is what we're trying to do, and we can survive that. The headwinds, which I deal with every day, are, I think, dissipating and will consolidate and drop. And this is not speculation because I have too many conversations with too many venture capitalists as well as importers that are bringing in these €1, less than €1, 50,000 gallon bladders of bad Beaujolais, and bottling it under numerous brands and selling them throughout the logistical network. And this is what it's about. This is the part that you and I are going to fight against. I'm never going to be that company. I don't want to be that company. If I wanted to grow to a big giant thing, I could certainly raise millions and millions of dollars to be invested in here and go jump into this logistical nightmare. But what it's coming down to is this logistics. They want to put as much wine, gallonage, bottles into the system to get to the consumer as fast and as soon as possible. And there's a whole logistical network now that starts in New Jersey, ends up in New York, gets fulfilled, and gets filtered out to all these different Groupon. I mean, where are you going to get Groupon wines that are 15 wines for $45 and a free corkscrew, right? And they're paying some X dollars for these customers and only getting so much in return. So that will, but I know guys that just raised $15 million. Another group raised $8 million. Wine.com just got $34 million. You and I can't compete with that, right? We'll never be able to do that. The only thing we have is this personal boutique approach to where the consumer trusts you. And I think consumerism is not going to change. It's always going to be the same. Eventually, they will trust the brand and the people behind the brand, because you can't trust. Well, I'll give you an example. I had Saturday Night Live Beaujolais, 2016. Horrible. I can't drink it. So if I'm the consumer that was watching Saturday Night Live or wherever this bottle came from and was marketed, and I bought it and I was trying to have an experience with my friends with a glass of wine, it's not a good experience. I'm not happy about that. It's not ethereal. I'm just going, God, look what I got. If you have to say not bad, it's bad, right?
What you and I have to do is to indulge in fantastic marketing, the same as these guys do, but with integrity behind it. Integrity, personal integrity of the products that we're dealing with. So that, I mean, I have a look. I've got, and between Valerie and I, we have cousins, or children of cousins, that are earning very, very good money, and they're in their mid-30s, and I ask them what they drink. And
focus group of sorts.
Yeah, and I ask them what they drink, and they spend $20, $30, and they drink decent wine. However, for that $20, $30, they can get so much better wine. But these are those very big brands, and I won't mention them, what they are out there, and they all think they discovered them. Them and all their friends think they discovered them. And so the key then is look, America's 25 million people. The kind of thing that you and I have been talking about right now, if there's 500,000 people out there or 1 million people out there that are the kind of target market for us, that's probably a lot until we really get education going. Maybe it's a little bit more. That's 0.1, 0.3%. Maybe it's 1%. Who knows? Yeah. But the key thing there is, if you've got 250,000 of those absolutely hanging on your every missive because of the things that you bring them, and you bring them direct to them with the absolute quality and integrity, You don't need 320 million people to make a really good living.
No, you don't. You mentioned this interesting statistic, and if you go to the Wine Institute, they'll tell you, and I use this analogy or this vision all the time. If you asked 100,000 people in America, do you drink wine? According to the Wine Institute, 25% of those 25,000 would raise their hand. Okay, do you drink wine? But that includes the woman just the other day at Ralph's that was buying a magnum of Sutter Home Sauvignon Blanc for $4.49. She'd raise her hand, right? She's
Right.
the one that would say, I drink wine.
Sure.
Or if you go to the Olive Garden, that person that has that glass of House Chianti at the Olive Garden, he also would, or she also would raise their hand. But are they a consumer? Are they a candidate for the services that we provide? Probably not, right?
No, they're
so
not.
really, you take it even further down. So maybe it's 5 to 7% of that 100,000 are people that would A, subscribe to a club, or B, buy wines direct from a master of wine because it's curated properly, or whatever scenario is. It's not a very big percentage, right? But what's happening is those people, even though they're out there, and we think that we know they're more sophisticated, but they can't turn down this idea. Wow, I can get 15 wines for $45, and they experiment with it. Or the Wall Street Journal Club, which is not all that much better than these other guys. They just package them differently. But the wines, they're a little better. I mean, I will say that they're a little better. And we're up against companies like Wink, which, I think they've been through $80 million already. That kind of horsepower gets you a lot of touch points, whether it's social, direct mail or whatever. It gets you a lot of touch points. They're going to respond to that. So those people have to filter out, and it's going to happen because the venture capitalists are going to run out of interest. They're not getting their money back, or if they're getting it back, it's taking a long time. 6 weeks ago, and this is my 30th year. Okay,
Wow.
It's been, I don't know, probably tasted somewhere around 90,000 wines, probably, if you just calculated my usual. It wasn't until 6 months ago, for the first time ever, not only did I get samples from my competitors to taste, because they're overstocked, because they've got this logistical nightmare now too, but I've been getting phone calls from venture capital research firms. So a company like Wink or anybody else calls and says, they look for money. And the venture capital firm says, we need to figure out what this industry is about. So they call these research firms, and these young kids call around and look for experts in the industry, and they call you and they pay you. So I've been paid somewhere around $6,000 for 6 sessions with totally separate venture capital groups asking the questions about the industry. All the stuff I just told you. That's kind of weird. For 30 years, I had one single phone call, and now I have 6 in a matter of a few weeks. What does it tell you? It tells you all these guys out there that have money, that want to be enamored with the wine industry, can't afford a winery, or don't want to be in the manufacturing, want to get into the business. They want to be part of this ambiance that we're part of. And most of them have stayed out of it. And they all quote the same things. What do you know about Wink? What do you know about Tasting Room? What do you know about Lot 18? What do you know about the new one is, it's a restaurant. Gosh, I forgot the name. Blue Apron, the guys that serve the food. They're bringing wines in now. Guess what they did? You're going to laugh at this. They did some market research, and they found that the average consumer or couple drinks 500 ml worth of wine rather than a 750. So they're having everybody that they buy wine from bottle in 500s. Who drinks a 500 ml? Why would you? Why would you buck the whole industry? And now, guess what? There's suppliers all over the state that are stuck with 500 ml bottles because they ordered it and didn't take it because it didn't work. It doesn't make any sense, right? So you and I we're in a difficult position, which is going to take persistence and tenacity to fight through all this cash that's behind these guys.
I think perhaps, but we're not in that business.
We're not.
We're not in that business, and we need to do what we have to do to separate ourselves from that business. From what I can see, the biggest guy, or one of the biggest guys in that direct-to-consumer model, has around 250 to 300,000 opted-in subscribers. It's been operating for many years now, and makes a fortune.
Yeah.
A fortune by my standards. I mean, a lot of money.
Yes.
But he's not in competition with these guys. The guys that are buying the wines that you have just described would not recognize but 5% of the wines that this guy's working with, because he's working with weird things from the Loire and the Jura and, all over the world. Yes, I mean, does he have things from California and Washington State? Of course he does. But the things that I'm interested in are all of these. I'm going through a phase right now of being interested in very minerally white wines. Mm-hmm. So he's a lot of importers. He represents, for example, quite a few Chablis producers. Chablis, one of the greatest white wines of the world. These are guys that can't really get a foothold in the market here because 5 Chablis is too many with these kind of guys out there. And so amazing Chablis available. And if you think about the cost of a bottle of wine, you know it already, right? If I can buy that Chablis for €6, and if it goes through the full 3-tier system, that €6 becomes €18. So by the time you convert it to US dollars, it's $21.99, $22.99, and on deal at $19.99.
Right.
Well, when he buys something like that, he can make almost all that money, sell it for $19.99, look like you giving the people a deal, make a lot of money, and give them something amazing.
Sure, that's
but
great.
No one's going to give you $50 million to do that. I don't think.
Exactly. That is the thing. But the money, the competition you're talking about. Yeah, I think the consumer, the type of consumer. You're absolutely right. The type of consumer that would take advantage of his service, or our service for that matter, is different than the one that's buying the Groupon wines. That's for sure. But the touch points where those people are hanging out, where people are Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or in the mail, they're all being hit by these other guys, and eventually they'll learn, and they're going to want. And this is, I want to dovetail onto this, and then we'll wrap this up, because you just said something interesting to me, and maybe it's the kind of client that we're looking for. You just said that you're into mineral whites right now. Now, my favorites whites have been the indigenous Italians forever. I just think they're fascinating. The Oneses and the Vermentinos and the Verdicchios. Those things are great. But the evolution is totally off the subject of business. The evolution of your palate, and I think the consumer needs to understand this. When I got married to my wife, she drank Gallo Chablis, literally the 1.5 liters. Now she is my biggest critic for reds and loves Bordeaux varietals. So tell me about the evolution of a person's palate. What have you seen? What do you know from your studies? As time goes on, is it more refined? Is that what's happening to our palates, that we're starting to tolerate character? Are we learning about character and we find it fascinating? What is the general?
It's the answer is quite long, so you may have to cut me off. But when this organization, we talked a little bit earlier about my first love of wine, those flames being fanned by producer Wholesale in South Africa. They wanted to introduce the idea of high-level wine education to improve the opportunity to sell more expensive wines. They wanted to educate the consumer so that the consumer would demand more than the base and raise the overall standard of wine drinking. We also used to have the old adage, people will gravitate from sweet white wine to dry red wine as they learn about wine, because wine is in some ways pretty much of a learned experience. It grows with you on time. So I sort of think to myself, if I have a look at how many people out there are truly pushing their wine knowledge, you see, your wife had the one advantage or disadvantage of living with you. And so I mean it from a wine perspective, not any other perspective.
Wait a minute, I was trying to figure that out, but I get it now.
Living with you, meaning you kept on bringing her better wine, yes. And so you were educating her palate.
Right, that's true.
And so you took her along. But some people get out there and they drink soda pop wine, and it's just fine for them, and they also like the price.
Which is fine.
And so I'm not sure that that's doing anything overall.
No, it's not.
And I don't think that the idea that you start somebody on $2 wine with 3% of sugar, and then that they will move up over a period of years to Chateau Lafite, I'm just not sure that that's going to happen. There's a certain portion of those people that get bitten by the bug.
Yes.
And we have to figure out how to get after those guys.
So the rest, like my friends that have the Napa cabs, they may not care that other things exist and that they're very interesting, and you can expand your palate and refine it and become more versatile in your wine knowledge. They may not care. They may just be perfectly happy to spend $40 on a bottle of Napa Cab or 50, and that's all I want.
I have friends like that too. I'm going to comment now on other friends of mine, very dear friends of mine. So if they're listening to this, I'm going to have a lot of explaining to do. But I will go and visit them in San Francisco, and usually I will be to visit one or other customer of mine or something like that. But I've always got wine with me, and it's always good. Usually my imports, but it's always good. So then I arrive in the house, and they've got an $8 bottle of this, and a $9 bottle of that, and an $11 bottle of that. And they always say to me, "But Peter, it's good enough for us. It's fine for us. We just like a glass of wine." And then I say, "Well, then try this," you see. And then their eyes open, and they're absolutely amazed. And of course, those are the bottles that vanish first. But then 3 months later, I'll arrive back in San Francisco, and it's $8 bottle, $9 bottle, $10 bottle of wine. So
that's funny.
You know, they appreciate the better wine. It's not that important to them.
Yes, right. But it lights you up when they light up,
yes,
doesn't it?
But it's not that important to them. Yeah. It's fine. So you and I, again, we also have a different requirement of a bottle of wine.
Right.
We don't want to sit at our dinner table and have something that's okay.
Right.
Life's
That's
too
exactly
short.
right.
Life's too short. We want to sit down and have something that we really get into. And I can get into, there are things I can get into. You mentioned Vermentino, which you can get for a reasonable price, or Muscadet, or things like that I can really get into that cost $10, $11. It doesn't have to be $400 a bottle.
They have fascinating character.
Yeah.
What did I have yesterday that we poured? Verdicchio. It was a Verdicchio blend. In fact, my tasting for the staff, there were two Italians. One was Corsican, and Corsican Verdicchio was fascinating, absolutely fascinating wine because of that Mediterranean influence. Well, we could go on, you and I, and we always do forever. And I don't know, we've probably been an hour already, right? Maybe we'll come back and do it again. But Peter, it's always a pleasure to talk wine with you, and bring your knowledge base to this table has been fascinating and more than I expected. So I appreciate it. Even though I expected we would have a good conversation anyway. So, hey, thanks a lot again. Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. The only thing missing was to be doing this with a glass or two.
Well, of wine. I know we could do that next time. Cheers.
Cheers.